We're joined in the studio by Charles La Shure. Charles is a professor of interpretation and translation at Hanguk University of Foreign Studies here in Seoul. He's also a very highly regarded translator of Korean literature, and he recently won the English Award at the Literature Translation Institute Korean 11th Korean Literature Translation Award. And he won it for his translation of celebrated Korean novelist kimyoungha's Blackflower. Charles, it's a real pleasure to have you in the studio this evening. Thank you for coming in. How are you today?
I'm doing good, Barry. Thank you for having me.
Well, no, like I said, it's a pleasure to have you in the studio. I'm very excited to talk to you. So can we talk a little bit first about your background? So tell us a little bit about yourself, Charles.
Mm-hmm. Well, as you said in your introduction, I'm teaching right now at Hanguk University of Foreign Studies. Before that, though, I did my master's and my PhD at Seoul National University in actually classical Korean literature with a concentration in oral literature, or I guess folklore would be a better way of putting it. And I did that for quite some time. And now I've been teaching at Hufs, as we call it, for 6 years.
Yeah, 6 years.
Yeah.
Where are you from originally?
Originally, I'm from New York, upstate New York, not the city, but New York State. And I was born on Long Island, spent all of my life in New York, and then came to Korea.
How long, all told, how long have you been living here?
18 years.
18 years, wow. What brought you here in the first place? What brought you to Korea?
Well, to be honest, probably a lack of anything better to do at the time. I had just graduated from university, and I was an English major. So as an English major, you don't have a wide range of options. It's either go into grad school or flip burgers or something like that. And I just want to do something a little different. So I had actually, in addition to my English major, I had studied Japanese and Japanese history, Japanese literature. I missed a Japanese minor by one course because I planned poorly. So my goal was actually to go to Japan, but I had an opportunity to come to Korea first. So I decided to come here and then, stay for 6 months or a year and then go to Japan. And, well, that was 18 years ago.
18 years ago.
And here I am.
So originally you just intended to stay for a short time.
Yeah.
And so what happened? What kept you here?
Well, I met someone, and you know how that goes, and it changed my perspective on things.
Right. Well, we won't ask you to talk too much about that. But, so regardless, you're here 18 years later, and you're sort of fully enmeshed in Korean literary culture. Can you tell us, how did you first become interested in Korean literature?
Well, I have always been interested in literature to start with. I mean, obviously I was an English major, English literature and creative writing and that sort of thing. And I had not really been exposed to Korean literature at all, as I guess most people in the United States at that time had not been. Before I came to Korea, I went to the library to look up what I could of Korean literature, and all our school library had was 2 books of short stories translated from the Korean, rather poorly, I might add. So I had studied Japanese literature, and I was familiar with Chinese literature in translation, and I just assumed that Korean literature did not have as rich of a tradition. But then I came to Korea, and my natural interest in literature just started me on the path to finding out more about it. And when I discovered that Korea had as rich a tradition as any other country, of course, it was, I guess, predestined.
Well, that's a great story. It's a story I think is quite common. I think lots of people have had that similar experience that you did. Now, we should say congratulations to you. Let's I'll take the opportunity to say congratulations on your award. So it was last year now, but it was very recently. It was the 11th awards from the LTI, and it was the English Translation Award. But can you tell us a little bit more about what it actually is?
Well, this is an award from the Literary Translation Institute of Korea, and they have 2 awards that they give out. One is the award for new translators, And that's the sort of award that you, I guess, apply for. They have certain works that you can translate. You translate a short story, and then you submit it for consideration. And I actually won that award 10 years ago in 2003.
I didn't know that.
That was sort of my first foray into literary translation.
Can you tell, what was the story?
It was called Planaria by Chun Sang-guk. It's a short story. Back then, you could do whatever you wanted. Now they have a specific, it's either one or two stories that you have to choose from.
I see.
But this was in the early days of that award, so you could choose whatever you wanted. I had won that in 2003. And this award is an award that you don't apply for, you don't submit yourself for consideration. They basically look at all of the works that have been translated into a given language over that period of time, and then they have a board of people, a panel of judges, I guess, who select the winners.
Well, can you introduce the book that you translated? What book did you win for?
Yes, this is, I actually brought it with me today, even though our listeners can't see it. It's Blackflower, 검은꽃 in Korean, by kimyoungha. And it's a historical novel. It's basically, to I guess give you the Cliff Notes version, would be the story of the first Korean immigrants to Mexico. And they went and they ended up working on henequen plantations. And this tells the story of their lives on those plantations and later how they played their own parts in the history of Mexico, which is actually quite fascinating because it's based on, obviously a true story.
Yeah, that's right. It's very closely based on historical facts, isn't it? Yeah.
I don't want to give anything away, but especially at the end, there's quite an interesting section about how they found a new nation in Guatemala, and that actually happened.
Yeah, it's a remarkable story, really, when you think about it. Well, tell us, how were you selected to translate it? Did you apply? What type of selection process is there for translating novels like this?
This was something that I had applied to the LTI Korea for funding, and I selected the novel myself, and I had to write up a prospectus, why I thought that this novel would do well in the American market, that sort of thing. And then I submitted this for consideration. And then at LTI Korea, they approve or not approve. And thankfully, they approved it. I chose this because, well, primarily because I read it and I thought it was a really great story. I love historical novels. I love, novels that have a sweeping, vast horizon, a large cast of characters. And it's a gripping story. And I thought, well, from what I know of American readers, they like historical novels. And it's also something that's interesting because it's a story of Korean characters, but at the same time, it's set in Mexico. So there's a certain level of familiarity, especially in the U.S., where Mexico's right on the border. So it allows American readers a point of access, I suppose, to approaching the story and to approaching these characters. So I thought for those reasons, it would, do well in the market. And my instinct has proven to be somewhat correct.
How is it doing? What has the reception been?
It's been pretty good. One of the reasons why I brought this version, the paperback version, is because it has a whole bunch of the reviews that have come out, which is good for my ego.
Give us a couple. Mention a couple. Do you have a favorite one?
It's hard to pick a favorite, but
they're all good.
They're all good. I mean, they have phrases like sprawling epic, which is what I was aiming for. Powerful, sweeping epic. I mean, I love stuff like that. And I did not feed any of these lines to the reviewers. They all came up with them on their own. So it's been pretty well received. And actually, I found out recently, I don't know if you're familiar with TED, the TED Talks. It was actually on the TED Christmas reading list.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I did not know that.
Yeah, one of my students sent me an email, and I was like, wow, that's pretty cool.
That is good. Yeah. Well done. Congratulations on that as well.
Thank you again.
Well, I'm always intrigued to find out about translators' goals or their approach when they're translating something. And I think I'm getting a bit of a sense of it from some of your answers already. But can you tell us, what were you trying to do when you were translating it? Or can you tell us about your approach?
Right. Well, I think the simplest way to put that would be, I wanted the readers to have as close to, the same experience that I had when I read the book. In technical terms, this would be called functional equivalence. But, putting it simply, when I read it, I was touched, I was moved, I was fascinated, I was intrigued, and I wanted the readers to experience all of that. So, in technical terms, there's obviously a faithfulness to the original text that is part of your responsibility as a translator, but you also have a responsibility to the reader to produce a work of literature that is going to be as moving as the original. That's our goal, at least, and that's how I approached it.
Well, during that process, how closely do you work with the writer? Were you sort of an intimate working relationship with kimyoungha, or are you alone on your own doing it?
Well, I would say that for the most part I was alone, but there were definitely times where I needed clarification on the original text, and at those times I was able to contact the author and just ask him any sort of question that I wanted to get clarification on that. And that was interesting because, as you know, he's a very famous author. He's a very interesting guy, authorship aside. But just having that contact with him gave me a lot of insight into the process that went into writing the book and that sort of thing.
That must be fascinating.
It was.
That window.
Yeah. It was great. And he has a very open attitude toward the process of translation. I would say basically our usual exchange would go something like, I'm not sure about this part. It doesn't really make sense to me. I was thinking about, what if we did it this way? And then his reply would be, sure.
Right.
Yeah, I don't think he ever opposed any idea that I came up with. I think there was one, he's like, well, what if we did it this way instead? But pretty much everything I came up with, he's like, yeah, sure, go ahead.
Oh, really?
That sounds fine, which surprised me at first because translators, our Bible is the text. We have to be faithful to that. And he would just be like, yeah, do whatever you have to do. And it was a bit uncomfortable at first, but after a while I was like, yeah, okay.
Right,
I can appreciate that.
I thought maybe they'd be more protective or really checking up on you.
Some writers are. Some writers are. kimyoungha in particular, he is very collaborative, I guess you could say. Yeah.
Well, let's move on from Blackflower. Okay. And now I understand you have a new translation coming out, or you're working on a new translation for the Dalkey series. Can you tell us a little about that?
Right. I've actually finished the translation, and I'm now in the process of fixing it up and cleaning it up to submit to the publisher.
Are you allowed to tell us what it is?
Sure, I am. Okay. This is, it's in Korean, the title is Taeha, which literally means something like Great River. And it's by Kim Nam-chun. It's a Japanese colonial period novel. I'm not giving you the English title because I don't know what that is yet.
Really? So that's still an ongoing issue that's under discussion?
I'm actually, at this very moment, I'm in discussion with the publisher. We're trying to think of a good title for the book because Great River, a literal translation, doesn't really tell you anything about the book. So we're thinking about other possibilities right now, but it's a novel of manners. It basically gives you a look into life in Korea during the Japanese colonial period, the early part of the Japanese colonial period, and it's, I guess, sort of a slice of life sort of thing, but very fascinating.
And it sounds much smaller scale than the sprawling epics that you.
It is. You like. It's a much smaller scale. It deals with a small village in what is now North Korea, upriver from Pyongyang, and it has a smaller cast of characters, a much more provincial feel to it. But it is very highly detailed, and in particular for the Western reader or the English-speaking reader, I think it's going to offer a very interesting look into life in Korea at that time. And especially at that time when you had the Enlightenment period and new Western civilization coming in, the way that people react to that is, for me, as one of those Westerners, is quite fascinating.
Yeah, that sounds very interesting indeed. I can't wait to read it.
I hope it will come out well.
Well, I also want to take the chance, having you here, to ask you about teaching translation. Can you tell us a little about that experience? What issues do you encounter with your students at Hufts?
Well, yeah, like I mentioned before, I've been doing this for 6 years now, and there's a lot of issues that I do encounter, and I'm sure we don't have time to get into all of those today. But I would say, I don't know, if I had to pick one issue, I think it would be just trying to work with the students and to help them reach a point where they can come to their own understanding of translation, where when they come into the GSIT, the Graduate School of Interpretation and Translation, they have these ideas and these preconceptions about translation, but often these ideas have been planted in them for the purpose of passing a test, getting into a school, that sort of thing. And I have to take them in the 2 years that I have with them, and I have to try to mold them into a translator who has his or her own philosophy of translation. I tell all of my students this. You have to have your own philosophy of translation. I can teach you my experiences, what I've learned, but in the end, you're on your own. You take what I tell you and you incorporate that into your own outlook, your own philosophy on translation. But I'm not the end-all be-all of translation. I'm just one part of hopefully what will become your overall philosophy. So if I had to pick one issue, that would probably be the big picture.
Right, it sounds like a very interesting experience. It sounds like a very challenging occupation as well at the same time.
It is.
Well, Charles, I'd also like to ask you, in terms of Korean writers, is there anybody that you really want to see translated? Who would you like to be out there in English?
Well, there's a writer that I've been thinking about for quite some time now that I would like to see translated, and that actually I would like to translate. This is something that this is something that I'm thinking about, and once I clear some other things off my plate, I'd like to get to. Another writer from the colonial period, actually, kimyoungha.
Kimyoungha.
And some of his more famous stories have been translated, but it's been done in sort of a piecemeal fashion by different translators. And I've read reviews of some of these translations, and they haven't always been as favorable, which may be because of the translation. It may be because of the accessibility of the story itself. So my dream at this point is to put together sort of like a critical edition of like a selection of his best stories with some analysis that will shed light on them and allow them to be more accessible to the English-speaking reader who's maybe not familiar with Korean culture.
That sounds like a good project too. I hope that comes to fruition for you.
It will someday.
I'm also curious to ask as well, seeing as you're so heavily involved in translation, how about your own writing? Have you attempted any short stories? Do you have any fiction works of your own that you're working on? Well,
as I mentioned this briefly in passing, but my major as an undergraduate was English with a concentration in creative writing, which I think helps a lot with translation. But truth be told, I have been let's say, not as enthusiastic with my own writing. But I have, in the past tried my hand. Nothing that's been published. But this is actually, this is something I do want to get back to. And actually, I'm pretty close with kimyoungha, and whenever we get together for dinner or drinks or something, he tells me, he's like, when you're ready to write a story, he's like, I'll translate it into Korean. I don't know if I should say that in public now, but anyway, he's promised me that he would translate.
It's out there now. He has.
Yeah,
to
he's
do
out.
It, yeah.
It's out there. But and the last time I saw him, which was like a couple of weeks ago, he's like, "So when are you going to write your story?" He's needling me to do it. I just need to get that fire lit under me. But yeah, it's definitely something that I want to get back to because it was my first love. Yeah, really.
Well, I hope you do get back to that.
Yeah.
I'd love to read something from you at some point in the future.
I'll try not to let you down.
A couple of things just to close off our interview today, Charles. Would you like to recommend a book for our listeners out there? A book or a writer that you think maybe we should investigate?
I'm gonna sort of go back to kimyoungha actually, and like I said, there are translations of his works out there. So I know some of them. Some of them I've read, and to be honest, I think the translations that are out there, I don't have any problems with them personally. I think it might be maybe the works are not as accessible, but if you're interested in Korean literature, and if you're looking for something different, and you have not read kimyoungha, definitely you want to read him because he has a very particular sense of humor. And you think Japanese colonial period literature, you think maybe a little darker, but he actually approaches life with a very unique sense of humor. And it's quite refreshing. So that's where I would go.
And can you tell us a little bit about Kimyoungha? Who exactly was Kimyoungha?
Like I said, he was a writer in the Korean, in the Japanese colonial period. I guess the interesting thing about him is that he died very young.
Oh, really?
I don't remember exactly how old he was. This is probably something I should have researched. But he died at a very young age, and but he left behind a rather large collection of short stories. I think around maybe 30 short stories that he left behind in his very brief time as a writer. But that, I think, makes his sense of humor all the more interesting because he had such a tragically short life, yet he was still able to look at life through this lens, not of darkness, but of humor, and to see the joy or the laughter in things.
Well, he certainly sounds like an interesting writer, and hopefully we'll have time to check him out at some point in the future.
I hope so.
And Charles, finally, would you like to recommend a song for us this evening?
Yeah, this is something that's been kicking around in my head. It's actually a song from before I was born. It's a Space Oddity by David Bowie.
Well, it's a great choice. Can you tell us why? Is there a particular reason?
It's a rather pedestrian reason, I have to say. Over the weekend, my wife and I went out to the cinema and we saw The Secret Life of Walter Mitty. I don't know if you've seen that film yet, but the song plays an important part in the film. And one of the characters talks about the song and says, it's a song about courage and going into the unknown. And it was something that just caused me to look at the song in a different way. And I've always liked it. It's always been, a favorite, but I've just had that on my mind.
Right. Well, it's an excellent choice. It's a great choice. And Charles, thank you very much indeed for coming into the studio this evening.
Thank you.
It was great talking to you. And that is, I'm afraid, all I've got prepared for this evening. I will be back next Saturday. Please stay tuned for Out and About with Sue Park. I'm Barry Welsh, and I leave you now with Charles La Shure's song request. This is David Bowie with Space Oddity.